Okay, so let's get right into it. When can a U.S. president actually deploy the military on American soil? It's a huge question, right? And it really cuts to the very heart of presidential power. And believe it or not, that exact question, that fundamental limit on presidential power, was just put to the test in a really high-stakes Supreme Court case, Trump versus Illinois. Now, this whole thing didn't start in some stuffy courtroom. Nope, it started out on the streets of Chicago, where tensions between federal immigration officers and protesters, well, they just reached a boiling point. So here's the situation according to the government's filings. You had federal officers being obstructed, threatened, even assaulted, all while trying to do their jobs. And on top of that, these protests at an ICE facility got pretty intense, allegedly causing property damage. So in the president's eyes, this was a full-blown crisis, one that he believed required military support. And that's what led him to federalize the National Guard. The president's entire legal justification for this action, it all came down to one single statute. Seriously, it all hinged on his determination that he was, and I'm quoting here, unable to enforce federal law with his regular forces. So that begs the question, right? What exactly are regular forces? Because as it turns out, the answer to that question would decide the whole shebang. And this is where it gets kind of wild. This whole massive, high-stakes legal battle, it really all boiled down to the interpretation of just two little words. And look, this wasn't just some nerdy debate over words. The definition was everything. If regular forces meant civilian law enforcement, like ICE agents, then the president just had to show they were overwhelmed. Easy enough. But if it meant the actual U.S. military, well, that's a whole different ballgame. He'd face a much, much higher legal hurdle before he could ever call in the Guard. All right, so the arguments are on the table, everyone's waiting, and the Supreme Court delivered its verdict on that emergency request to deploy the Guard. And the decision was deployment blocked. The court flat out denied the government's request, which meant the National Guard could not be deployed in Chicago. Okay, so to really get why the court made this call, we have to talk about another really important law, the Posse Comitatus Act. Think of it like a firewall that's been in place for a long, long time, specifically to keep the military out of domestic policing. And that principle, it became absolutely central to the majority's decision here. This is what led the court to what you could call a two-lock system. It's a great way to think about it. So lock number one, to federalize the Guard, the president first has to show he's unable to use the active duty military. Simple enough, right? But here's the catch. Lock number two is the Posse Comitatus Act, which basically forbids him from using the military for this kind of domestic law enforcement in the first place, unless there's a specific legal exception. And since the government couldn't point to an exception, well, they couldn't even get the key into the first lock. But here's the thing. This decision was not unanimous, not by a long shot. And when you dig into the other opinions, the concurrences and the dissents, you see a Supreme Court that is deeply fractured over how to handle this huge question of presidential power. Take Justice Kavanaugh, for example. He actually agreed with the final outcome, no deployment, but he was worried that the way the majority got there could cause some major problems down the road. He basically proposed a much simpler off-ramp for the case. He said, look, the president never officially stated that the U.S. military itself was unable to act. He only talked about civilian officers. For Kavanaugh, that was enough to decide the case right there. He argued the court didn't need to dive into all these other huge legal questions, and that by doing so, it was risking a dangerous precedent for real future emergencies. Then you have the dissent from Justice Alito, who was joined by Justice Thomas, and it was a forceful one. He basically argued the court totally overstepped its role here. Alito's main point was that the court shouldn't have even touched that regular forces definition because both sides had actually agreed on a different meaning in the lower courts. He accused the majority of basically inventing a new legal theory just for this case. And he argued that by doing this and by ignoring what he saw as clear evidence of violence, the court was actively preventing the president from protecting federal officers. Justice Gorsuch also dissented, and his whole argument was about urging extreme caution. He pointed out just how many massive, unanswered questions this case raised. I mean, the court had never interpreted this specific statute before, and now, on a rushed emergency basis, they were suddenly wading into these gigantic questions about the Posse Comitatus Act and the president's inherent powers. He just wasn't comfortable making those calls so quickly. So, okay, Where does this leave us? What does this ruling actually mean going forward? Because beyond just this one case in Chicago, it has some really significant implications for the balance of power in the U.S. So, here are the big takeaways. First, the ruling reinforces a really high bar for using military forces inside the country. It's meant for truly exceptional circumstances. Second, it creates this new direct link between the National Guard Act and the Posse Comitatus Act. But, and this is crucial, it leaves a ton of questions unanswered about the president's power. And finally, it just lays bare how fractured this court is. So while this one deployment was blocked, the bigger debate over presidential authority in a crisis, yeah, that is far from over. And it really leaves us with a tough question, doesn't it? In the next crisis, is that line between protecting federal property and domestic policing clear enough to prevent another conflict? This case really forces us to think about that fine line between authority and overreach, a question that's right at the heart of the American system of government. And you can bet the Supreme Court will be facing it again. And just a quick reminder, as always, this is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This is not legal advice.